The camping trip was supposed to be our escape from the city, a chance for the four of us to disconnect and remember why we became friends in the first place. We'd chosen a remote spot in the Colorado mountains, far from the marked trails and designated campgrounds. Mark had insisted on going somewhere authentically wild, as he called it. Sometimes I wonder if things would have been different if we'd just stuck to the regular camping areas. The drive up took longer than expected, with the dirt roads becoming increasingly narrow and treacherous. By the time we found a suitable clearing to set up camp, the late afternoon sun was already casting long shadows through the pine trees. Sarah and Jake worked on the tents while Mark and I gathered firewood. That's when I first saw it. I was picking up a fallen branch when movement at the tree line caught my eye. At first, I thought it was just another camper, maybe someone exploring from a nearby site. But something felt off about the way it stood there. Too still, too tall. The figure was partially obscured by the shadows of the dense forest, but I could make out its basic shape, impossibly thin and at least 7 feet tall. "Hey, Mark," I called out, trying to keep my voice steady. "Do you see that?" He followed my gaze and squinted. "See what?" "That." I pointed, but as soon as I did, the figure seemed to melt back into the darkness between the trees. Mark laughed. "Man, you're already getting spooked? We haven't even started telling ghost stories yet." I forced a chuckle, but something about that figure had set me on edge. We finished gathering wood and returned to the clearing where Sarah and Jake had finished setting up the tents. "Nice spot you found, Mark," Sarah said, dusting off her hands. "Feels like we're the only people for miles." That thought, which had seemed exciting during our planning, now made my stomach twist uncomfortably. As we set up the rest of camp, I kept glancing at the tree line. The sun was setting faster now, the shadows growing longer and deeper. Twice more I caught glimpses of the figure, always in my peripheral vision, always gone when I turned to look directly at it. Around the campfire that evening, I finally mentioned what I'd seen. "Guys, I know this sounds crazy, but I think something's watching us." Jake immediately grinned. "Oh man, is it the legendary Colorado Bigfoot?" "I'm serious," I insisted. "I keep seeing this tall figure in the trees." "Probably just a bear standing up," Sarah suggested, but she started scanning the darkness beyond our firelight. That's when Mark pointed. "Wait, I see it too." We all turned. There it was, standing motionless at the edge of the firelight's reach. The shadows made it impossible to discern any features, but its height was undeniable. We sat in stunned silence, watching it watch us. Jake broke the tension with a nervous laugh. "Hey buddy, want to join us for s'mores?" The figure didn't move. "Maybe we should pack up," Sarah whispered, but Mark shook his head. "It's probably just trying to scare us off. Wild animals do that sometimes." But this was no animal. As we sat there, trying to act normal while stealing glances at our silent observer, I noticed something that made my blood run cold. Every time one of us would shift position or reach for something, the figure would make the exact same movement, just a split second later. "Guys," I said quietly, "don't move for a minute, just watch it." We all sat perfectly still. The figure remained motionless too. Then Jake slowly raised his right hand. The figure's arm rose in perfect synchronization. "What the heck?" Sarah breathed. Mark grabbed his flashlight. "That's it. I'm gonna see what this thing is." He stood up suddenly, and the figure matched his movement precisely. When he took a step forward, it took a step forward too, maintaining the exact same distance. "Mark," I warned, but he was already striding toward the tree line, flashlight beam bouncing ahead of him. The figure retreated into the darkness, always staying just beyond the reach of the light. Mark followed it for about 50 feet before stopping. "There's nothing here," he called back to us. "Whatever it was, it's gone now." But as soon as he turned off his flashlight to head back, I saw it again, this time closer to our camp than before. We tried to ignore it as the night wore on, but its presence was impossible to forget. Every movement we made, it copied. Every time we shined a light in its direction, it vanished, only to reappear somewhere else when we looked away. Around midnight, we decided to try to get some sleep. "Safety in numbers," Sarah suggested, so we all crammed into the largest tent. None of us wanted to be alone. I don't think any of us actually slept. We lay there in the darkness, listening to the normal sounds of the forest, and something else. Something that sounded like breathing, just outside the tent walls. When dawn finally began to lighten the sky, we made the unanimous decision to pack up and leave. We worked quickly, taking down the tents and stuffing our gear into our backpacks with barely a word spoken between us. Every few seconds, one of us would glance over our shoulder at the tree line. It was Sarah who spotted it first, there, she whispered, pointing to our left. The figure stood between two pines, its form still somehow shadowy despite the morning light, mirroring Sarah's pointing gesture. When we all turned to look, it vanished. "Over there!" Jake's voice cracked as he gestured to the opposite side of the clearing. The figure had reappeared, now perfectly copying Jake's stance, one hand raised in alarm. We abandoned any pretense of packing methodically, grabbing what we could and leaving the rest. Every time we looked up, the figure had moved to a different position among the trees, always maintaining the same distance, always mimicking whoever had last moved. It was like a grotesque game of statues, the figure jumping from spot to spot each time we looked away, frozen in our poses when we caught sight of it. "Just get to the cars," Mark said through gritted teeth. "Don't look back." But we couldn't help ourselves. As we hurried across the clearing, we kept checking over our shoulders. With each glance, the figure appeared in a new location, by the old oak, behind the fallen log, between the young saplings. Always watching, always copying, always waiting. The last time I looked, just before we reached the vehicles, I saw it standing at the edge of the clearing. All four of its arms were raised in an exact mirror of our positions as we gripped our car door handles. We drove away so fast we nearly got stuck twice on the rough road. Nobody spoke until we reached the highway. And even then, all Mark said was, "We're never camping again." The others nodded in agreement, but I couldn't stop thinking about what we'd left behind. Our tents, our supplies, everything. Part of me wonders if they're still there, if other hikers have found our abandoned campsite, but a bigger part of me wonders about that figure, still standing in the trees, waiting for the next group of campers to mimic, to follow, to frighten. Sometimes late at night, I catch myself looking out my window at the shadows, watching for any movement that might be watching me back. I've done plenty of solo camping trips before, but this one sticks with me for all the wrong reasons. I don't even know how to explain it properly. It sounds ridiculous when I say it out loud. But I heard something out there, something I can't explain. This happened last fall, mid-October, along a quieter section of the Appalachian Trail. The air had that perfect crispness to it, the kind that makes hiking in the daytime comfortable, and the nights just cold enough to huddle inside your sleeping bag. I'd planned a simple 3-day solo trek, nothing too intense, just some peaceful time away from everything. I started from a small trailhead in Virginia, somewhere off a long gravel road that took way too long to drive down. It was one of those access points that only had a basic wooden sign and a single car parked at the lot. I didn't see anyone else, which was exactly what I wanted. The first day was uneventful. Peaceful, even. I hiked about 8 miles in, taking my time and stopping to admire the fall colors. The leaves were a brilliant mix of red and gold, and every so often, a gust of wind would send them swirling down onto the trail. It was the kind of quiet that makes you feel like you're the only person left in the world. I set up camp near a small clearing close to a natural spring. It was an ideal spot, flat ground, plenty of firewood, and far enough from the trail that I wouldn't be bothered by any stray hikers. Not that I expected to see anyone. That night, I made a small fire, cooked some freeze-dried chili, and sat there listening to the sounds of the forest. Owls hooted somewhere in the distance, and every now and then, I'd hear something rustling in the underbrush. Probably just a raccoon or a deer. Nothing unusual. By 10, I crawled into my tent and zipped myself inside my sleeping bag. I fell asleep almost immediately. The next day was just as peaceful. I spent the morning exploring the area around my camp, climbing up a small ridge that overlooked the valley below. There wasn't a single sign of civilization, just an endless stretch of forest, rolling hills, and thick mist settling in the distance. By afternoon, I decided to stay another night in the same spot instead of moving further up the trail. I wasn't in a rush, and I liked the solitude. I gathered more firewood, cooked an early dinner, and settled in before sunset. The temperature dropped fast, and I found myself bundled up in my jacket, watching the fire flicker against the trees. It was almost too quiet, the kind of silence that makes you hyper-aware of every little sound. Sometime after midnight, I woke up. At first, I didn't know why. The fire had burned down to embers, and my breath came out in white puffs in the cold air. I lay there listening, trying to figure out what had pulled me from sleep. Then I heard it. A scream. Not an animal, not a fox or a bobcat, nothing like that. It was a man. Or at least, it sounded like one. It came from somewhere deep in the trees, echoing through the valley. Long, drawn out, and agonizing. The the kind of scream that makes your stomach twist up in knots. I shot up, heart pounding so hard I could barely breathe. I sat there in the dark, frozen, waiting for something else, another noise, a voice, anything. Nothing. The silence that followed was somehow worse. No crickets, no wind, no rustling leaves. Just a heavy, suffocating stillness. Then it happened again. A second scream, even longer than the first. This time it sounded closer. I scrambled for my headlamp and flicked it on, the beam of light cutting through the darkness. The trees loomed around me, their shadows stretching long and thin. I listened, barely breathing, waiting to hear footsteps, branches breaking, anything. But the woods were still. I don't know how long I sat there. 5 minutes? 10? It felt like forever. I kept expecting someone to come crashing through the trees, bleeding, begging for help. But no one did. And that's when I realized something that made my skin crawl. The screams had come from the same direction both times. Exactly the same. The same distance, the same tone. Like a recording being played over and over. I packed up my gear in under 5 minutes. I didn't care how late it was, I wasn't staying out there. I barely took the time to kick dirt over my fire before throwing on my pack and heading for the trail. I hiked in the dark for hours, only stopping when I was sure I'd put enough distance between myself and whatever the hell that was. Eventually, I found a spot near a bend in the trail and sat with my back against a tree, gripping my pocket knife like it would do anything. I didn't sleep. I just waited for morning. At first light, I practically ran the rest of the way back to the trailhead. My car was still there, sitting alone in the gravel lot. I threw my gear in the trunk, got in, and locked the doors. But I couldn't just leave. What if it was someone who actually needed help? What if I had abandoned a person out there? I drove to the nearest ranger station, a small cabin-like building a few miles away. 2 guys were inside, both older, both looking like they'd spent their whole lives in the woods. I told them everything, trying to keep my voice steady. They listened without interrupting. No raised eyebrows, no skepticism, just quiet nods. When I finished, one of them sighed and glanced at the other before saying, "You're not the first to hear it." That made my stomach drop. They went on to explain that every few years, someone reports hearing the same thing. A scream, always at night, always in that same area. They've checked every time. Nothing. No footprints, no signs of struggle, just silence. They didn't have an explanation. Could be the wind, maybe an animal, one of them offered, but even he didn't sound convinced. I asked if anyone had ever gone missing there. They said no. Not that we know of, anyway. That was the last thing they said before I left, and I haven't been back since. I should have trusted my instincts the moment I met him on the trail. There was something wrong about his smile. Too wide, too eager. But I dismissed it as my usual social anxiety around strangers. That was my first mistake. The morning had started perfectly. I'd driven 3 hours from the city to reach this remote trailhead in the Cascade Mountains, eager to spend a few days alone in nature. The September air was crisp, carrying that distinct autumn scent of decaying leaves and damp earth. My backpack was perfectly packed with everything I needed for 3 days of solitude. My one-person tent, sleeping bag, water filter, and enough freeze-dried meals to keep me going. I'd been hiking for about 2 hours when I first encountered him. The trail had been winding through old-growth forest, massive Douglas firs towering overhead, their branches creating a natural cathedral ceiling that filtered the sunlight into scattered beams. The path ahead curved around a large boulder, and as I rounded it, there he stood. He was a tall man, probably in his 50s, wearing hiking clothes that looked too new, like someone who just bought everything from REI without actually breaking it in. His boots were pristine, which struck me as odd given the muddy conditions of the trail. He carried a small day pack that seemed too light for any serious hiking. "Beautiful morning for a hike," he said, his voice carrying an odd lilt that made the hair on the back of my neck stand up. Despite the cool temperature, sweat beaded on his forehead. "Yeah, it is," I replied, trying to step around him. The trail was wide enough for 2 people, but he had positioned himself in the middle, forcing me to either stop or squeeze past. "Planning to camp?" he asked, nodding at my large backpack. His eyes seemed to catalog every detail of my gear, lingering too long on each item. Just passing through, I lied instinctively. Something in my gut told me not to share my actual plans. He took a step closer, and I caught a whiff of something strange, not body odor or cologne, but something chemical, like cleaning supplies. There's a beautiful campsite about 2 miles ahead near Cedar Creek. Very private, perfect for solo campers. The way he emphasized solo made my stomach turn. Thanks, but I'm meeting friends further up, I lied again, taking a deliberate step backward. They're probably wondering where I am. His smile widened, showing too many teeth. I've been on this trail since sunrise and haven't seen anyone else. He cocked his head slightly, like a bird studying its prey. Which trailhead did your friend start from? I forced a casual shrug, trying to keep my voice steady. We planned to meet at the junction with the Ridge Trail. Another lie, but I needed to end this conversation. Ah, the Ridge Trail, he nodded. But something in his expression told me he knew I was lying. That's quite a trek. You should really consider that spot by Cedar Creek instead. I know all the best camping locations around here. I'd be happy to show you. I appreciate the offer, but I should get going. I finally managed to edge past him, my heart pounding despite my attempts to appear calm. Of course, he said to my back as I walked away. Maybe I'll see you around. I frequently patrol these trails. The word patrol sent a chill down my spine. I waited until I was around the next bend before glancing back. He was gone, but I could have sworn I heard a twig snap in the underbrush away from the trail. I walked faster after that, constantly checking over my shoulder. The peaceful serenity of my morning hike had evaporated, replaced by a gnawing unease. Every rustle of leaves made me jump. Every shadow seemed to hide a lurking figure. By early afternoon, I'd convinced myself I was being paranoid. I hadn't seen the man again, and the trail had been peaceful, if lonely. I'd passed several promising campsites, but kept going, wanting to put as much distance as possible between myself and that morning's encounter. Around 4 o'clock, I found what seemed like the perfect spot to make camp. It was set back from the trail about 50 yards, in a small clearing surrounded by thick undergrowth and massive cedars. A tiny stream burbled nearby, not Cedar Creek. I'd made sure of that, providing easy access to water. The undergrowth would make it difficult for anyone to approach without making noise, and I had a clear line of sight to the trail through a gap in the vegetation. I set up my tent with practiced efficiency, then gathered firewood while there was still plenty of light. As I worked, I kept scanning the surrounding forest, but saw nothing unusual. Just birds, squirrels, and the occasional chipmunk. The forest felt alive in a normal, healthy way, which helped ease my anxiety. As dusk approached, I got a small fire going and prepared one of my freeze-dried meals, beef stroganoff, that tasted nothing like actual beef stroganoff, but was hot and filling. The flames cast dancing shadows on the surrounding trees, and for a while, I managed to relax, even pulling out my Kindle to read a few chapters of the thriller I downloaded for the trip. The first twig snap came just as full darkness settled in. I looked up from my book, scanning the darkness beyond my fire's light. It had sounded close. Too close, but I couldn't see anything in the thick shadows. Probably just a deer or raccoon, I told myself. But I couldn't shake the memory of that strange man's smile. I tried to return to my book, but my concentration was shot. Every sound from the forest seemed amplified now. The wind in the branches, the stream's quiet gurgle, the soft hooting of an owl. Normal night sounds, I kept telling myself. Nothing to worry about. Then another snap, closer this time, followed by what sounded distinctly like footsteps trying to be quiet and not quite succeeding. My heart began to race. I reached for my flashlight, a powerful LED model that could illuminate objects hundreds of feet away, but hesitated to turn it on. If someone was out there, the light would reveal my exact position while temporarily blinding me to anything outside its beam. Another snap, definitely footsteps now. Moving around the perimeter of my camp, I stood up slowly, trying to keep my breathing steady as I strained to locate the source of the sound. The fire had died down to glowing coals, providing just enough light to create confusing shadows, but not enough to see clearly. The footsteps stopped. The forest seemed to hold its breath. Even the stream seemed quieter. I clicked on the flashlight and swept its beam in a wide arc around my camp. The powerful light caught tree trunks, bushes, fallen logs, but no sign of anyone. Just as I was about to convince myself it had been my imagination, something moved at the edge of the light's reach. A shadow detached itself from behind a tree and melted into the darkness. My hands were shaking now as I kept the light trained on that spot, but whatever I'd seen was gone. I did a complete circuit of my camp with the beam, seeing nothing but ordinary forest. The footsteps had stopped, but the damage was done. I knew I wasn't alone. I retreated to my tent, zipping myself inside even though I knew the thin nylon walls offered no real protection. I left my flashlight on, pointing it at the tent's ceiling to create a dome of light around me. Every shadow that moved across the tent walls made my heart skip. Sleep was impossible. I lay fully clothed on top of my sleeping bag, my camping knife close at hand, Listening to the night sounds and trying to distinguish natural forest noises from human movement, time seemed to crawl. I checked my phone, obsessively no service, of course. I was truly alone out here, miles from the nearest person. Well, except for whoever was watching me. Around 3 in the morning, the footsteps returned. They circled my tent slowly, deliberately, like someone taking their time to study my campsite. I held my breath, knife clutched in my trembling hand, as the steps completed their circuit and retreated into the forest. I didn't move until the first hint of dawn began to lighten the sky. My muscles were stiff from lying tensely for hours, and my eyes burned from lack of sleep. As soon as it was light enough to see clearly, I unzipped the tent and peered out. The morning mist hung low over my campsite, making everything look slightly unreal. My fire pit was cold, the ashes undisturbed. Nothing seemed out of place, but something caught my eye near the edge of the clearing. Footprints. Clear boot prints in the damp earth, circling my tent exactly as I'd heard during the night. They weren't my boots, these prints were larger, with a distinctive tread pattern I recognized from the day before. As I stared at the prints, movement in the forest caught my eye. Through the morning mist, about 50 yards away, a figure stood partially hidden behind a massive cedar. Even at that distance, I could make out the too-wide smile, the eager eyes watching me. It was him, the man from the trail. He lifted one hand in a friendly wave, as if we were old acquaintances meeting for coffee rather than strangers in the wilderness. Then, with deliberate slowness, he crouched down behind the tree, never taking his eyes off me. That was enough. I threw my gear into my backpack with frantic speed, not bothering to pack properly or even take down the tent correctly. I just yanked up the stakes, stuffed the whole mess into its bag, and practically ran back to the trail. The whole time, I could feel his eyes on me, watching my panic with that same eager smile. I didn't stop running until I reached my car, 3 hours later. My legs were shaking, my lungs burning, but fear had kept me moving at a pace I didn't think possible with a full pack. I passed several other hikers on my way out, but barely registered their concerned looks as I rushed past. Only when I was in my car with the doors locked did I finally let myself break down, shoulders shaking as the full weight of what had happened hit me. I started the engine with trembling hands and drove away as fast as I safely could on the winding forest road. It took several days before I could sleep properly again, and weeks before I stopped jumping at unexpected sounds. I filed a report with the park rangers, providing as detailed a description as I could, but I never heard if they found him or not. I still go hiking. I refuse to let one experience ruin my love of the outdoors, but never alone anymore. And I've learned to trust that first instinct, that gut feeling when something isn't right. Because sometimes that feeling is trying to tell you that the stranger on the trail isn't just being friendly. Sometimes that too wide smile is hiding something much darker. I don't know how to explain the fear I felt that night. I've gone on plenty of solo camping trips before, and I thought I knew what to expect. But nothing prepared me for what happened deep in the Rocky Mountains, when I found myself trapped in my tent as a massive bear tried to claw its way in. I still don't know how I made it out alive. I had been planning this trip for weeks, a solo camping getaway, 2 nights in the Rocky Mountains, completely off the grid. No cell service, no distractions, just me, my tent, and the quiet of the wilderness. The trail was about 8 miles in, leading to a small, secluded clearing near a stream. Perfect for camping. The hike-in was peaceful. I took my time, soaking in the scenery. Towering pines, crisp mountain air, and the distant sound of running water. Exactly what I needed. But about 5 miles in, I noticed something that made me stop. Deep claw marks on a tree. They were long, jagged, and fresh. The exposed wood was pale, still slightly damp. I hesitated, staring at them. Bear markings. Probably a black bear. I knew they scratched trees to mark territory, and while it wasn't uncommon, something about these marks unsettled me. They were high up, higher than I expected, and they were deep, like whatever made them had massive claws. I shook it off and kept hiking. Bears are common here, no big deal. By the time I reached my campsite, the sun was starting to dip. The clearing was perfect, flat ground, a nearby stream, and plenty of trees for cover. I set up my tent, gathered firewood, and cooked a simple meal. As I ate, the sky darkened, the sounds of the forest shifting into night mode. Crickets, the occasional hoot of an owl, the rustling of small animals in the brush. Then I heard something else, a low, heavy rustling. It came from the tree line, maybe 50 feet away. I froze, listening. Something big was moving. I grabbed my flashlight and pointed it toward the noise. Nothing. Just trees and darkness. I told myself it was probably a deer, maybe an elk. But when I turned off my flashlight, the rustling stopped. It didn't run off like a deer would. It just stopped. That was the first time I felt a prickle of unease. I crawled into my tent, zipped it up, and lay in my sleeping bag listening. At first, everything was normal. The occasional breeze rustled the trees, the stream gurgled softly. Then, the heavy footsteps came back. They were slow, deliberate, circling. My breath caught. I stayed completely still. It sounded big. I wanted to unzip my tent and look, but a deep, primal fear told me not to. The footsteps stopped. For what felt like an hour, I lay frozen, barely breathing. Eventually, exhaustion won. I told myself it was just an animal passing through. I drifted into a restless sleep. Morning light seeped through my tent. I forced myself up, trying to shake the unease from the night before. Then I saw the tracks. Huge paw prints in the dirt circling my tent. My stomach dropped. I followed them a few feet and found fresh claw marks on another tree. They looked new. Something was watching me last night. I should have packed up right then. But I told myself it was just a bear passing through. If it had wanted to attack, it would have. I decided to stay. That was a mistake. I spent the day exploring the area, hiking up a ridge for a better view. But the whole time, I felt watched. Whenever I stopped moving, the forest felt too quiet. No birds, no rustling leaves, just silence. And then there was the smell. A thick, musky odor hung in the air. It was faint, but unmistakable. I'd read about this before. Bears have a distinct scent. Something was close. I turned back to camp early. As the sun dipped below the trees, the unease in my chest grew. I made a small fire, cooked dinner, but had no appetite. The silence was oppressive. The only sound was the crackling fire. Then, a branch snapped. Close. I grabbed my flashlight and shone it toward the trees. Nothing. The fire flickered. My hands trembled. I forced myself into my tent, zipped it up. Then the footsteps came back. Heavy. Slow. Circling. I held my breath, gripping my knife. Something huffed outside my tent. A deep, guttural sound. It knew I was in here. Then came the scraping. Long, slow claws dragging down the fabric of my tent. I felt my stomach clench. I stayed perfectly still. Don't move. Don't breathe. The scratching stopped. Then, nothing. I lay there, heart pounding, waiting. Eventually, exhaustion took me again. I woke up at dawn. The campsite was a disaster. My backpack was torn open. Claw marks raked across the dirt. Something had been here. I moved fast, packing my gear. I needed to get out. Then, a deep, guttural exhale. I turned and saw it. A massive grizzly bear, just past the tree line. Watching me, I froze. It took one step forward. I didn't think. I lunged into my tent and zipped it shut. Stupid, I know, but my body acted on instinct. Then the bear charged. It slammed into the tent. The fabric buckled inward, claws ripped through the nylon. I curled into a ball, playing dead. The tent shook violently. The bear was snorting, huffing, tearing at the fabric. I felt its hot breath on my face. It pawed at me, testing. I stayed motionless. Then it stopped. Silence. I didn't move. Then, slow, heavy footsteps. Fading. The bear was leaving. I stayed curled in a ball for what felt like forever. When I finally uncurled, the sky was bright. I crawled out of my destroyed tent. The bear was gone. I packed in record time. Every step on the trail felt like something was right behind me. Finally, I saw my car. I threw my pack in, jumped inside, locked the doors. And then, movement in the trees. As I drove away, I glanced in the rearview mirror. For just a second, I saw it, a massive, dark shape, watching. I didn't stop driving until I was miles away.